A black employee was humiliated and fired by her boss, who was about to get married, on the day of. Hello, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any stories. Tasha was sitting at her desk, surrounded by the usual office noise. The sound of keyboards being typed frantically, the murmur of conversations between colleagues, and the distant hum of printers. She was focusing on her work, a project that demanded her meticulous attention, when suddenly she heard David's authoritative voice calling her. Tasha's heart raced. She knew that a meeting with him was never a good sign. "Tasha, come here a minute," said David, his tone of voice laden with an arrogance that always bothered her. He was the kind of boss who thought he was above everyone else, and Tasha had already felt the devaluation he applied to his subordinates. Taking a deep breath, Tasha stood up and walked to his office, feeling a chill in her stomach. As she entered, she noticed that the room's decor was as oppressive as David's presence. He was sitting behind an imposing desk, looking at her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Close the door," he ordered, and Tasha obeyed, feeling her stomach turn. "You did well on your last project, but we need to talk about your position here." "Of course, David. What's going on?" Tasha forced a smile, trying to hide her apprehension. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, and his tone became colder. "The truth is that you are no longer aligned with the company's objectives. Your performance hasn't been what we expected, and we need someone who is more committed. I'm going to have to terminate you." His words cut like a knife. Tasha was paralyzed for a moment, trying to process what she had just heard. "But I worked hard. I always—" she began, but David interrupted. "Working hard isn't enough. You have to understand that the corporate world is unforgiving. If you don't adapt, you get left behind. I hope you have a good future ahead of you," he said, getting up to look out of the window, as if completely disregarding her presence. With her head spinning and her eyes burning, Tasha left the room in silence, her humiliation following her. As she passed the cubicles, she felt the curious stares of her colleagues. Some had expressions of sympathy, others of relief, but all shared an unspoken understanding of David's oppression. As Tasha left the company, she spotted some employees gathered outside, talking quietly. She approached and noticed that her friends, Anna and Juliana, had worried looks on their faces. "Hi, Tasha. What happened? You look pale," asked Anna, with genuine concern. "I've been fired," Tasha replied, her voice almost cracking. "David said I wasn't in line with the company's objectives. I don't know what I'm going to do now." Juliana shook her head, indignant. "That's so unfair. He's always been a tyrant." "You're not the only one going through this." Tasha raised her head, puzzled. "What do you mean? What do you mean?" Anna took a deep breath and began to share. "You know, I worked with him on a project last year. He always sidelined me, and when I brought up an idea, he just ignored it and gave credit to someone else. This kind of thing happens all the time. He has a pattern of abusive behavior. And it's not just me," Juliana continued. "Many of us have been in similar situations. He does it all the time." "Tasha. He thinks he's king." Her words resonated deeply with Tasha. The powerlessness she felt began to turn into a discomfort, a seed of resistance beginning to germinate. "This can't go on like this," she said, determination growing inside her. "We need to do something." The three women exchanged meaningful glances, a silent understanding forming between them. Tasha realized that she was not alone. There was a support network among those who had been silenced. Together, they could find a way to expose the truth about David and the toxic environment he created. Determined not to be just a victim, Tasha decided it was time to act. After her dismissal, a sense of frustration and powerlessness washed over her, but she knew she couldn't stand by while David continued to manipulate and oppress other women. In her home, surrounded by piles of documents and a cup of cold coffee, Tasha began to investigate David's life. She accessed social networks, forums, and, with the help of some colleagues, gathered information about his past. One evening, while analyzing David's posts on LinkedIn, Tasha came across a comment from a former colleague that intrigued her. True leadership shows itself in difficult times. Always remember that, David. The seemingly innocent comment suggested that there was a lot more to David's story than it seemed at first glance. "What are you hiding, David?" Tasha muttered to herself, determined to find out the truth. The next day, Tasha invited her friends, Anna and Carla, to her apartment for a meeting. They sat around the table, the atmosphere charged with tension and anticipation. "I've found out a few things about David," Tasha began, her voice firm. "He's not who he says he is. He seems to have a pattern of behavior. I'm not the only one who has suffered at his hands." Anna, who had worked with David a few years ago, frowned. "What do you mean? He's always been so respectful of me." "Respectful? Didn't you see how he treated the women on the team?" Tasha replied, her frustration showing. "He made inappropriate comments and always made it clear that he had greater power. I remember when Carla left. It was a nightmare for her." Carla, who was listening intently, agreed. "Yes, he put pressure on me on several occasions. When I resigned, I was so relieved. But I never felt comfortable talking about it. He was always supportive." Tasha took a deep breath, realizing that the conversation was intensifying. "We need to come together. He needs to be exposed, not just for me, but for all of us. We can allow him to continue hurting other women." The friends looked at each other, and determination began to grow among them. "What if we set up a support group?" suggested Anna. "We can bring together other female employees who have also been victims of David. If we get enough witnesses, maybe we can expose him once and for all." "Yes, that's a great idea," Tasha agreed excitedly. "We can meet weekly and share our stories. That might give us the strength we need to take action." The following weeks were full of meetings and sharing experiences. They set up a messaging group to keep in touch and share information. The group grew, and more women began to join them, each bringing their own story of pain and overcoming. One evening, while they were meeting in a cafe, Tasha learned that David was about to get married. "I've heard rumors that he's going to marry Sarah, the new employee," Carla said, with a worried look on her face. "This could be our chance. If we expose the truth during the wedding, he won't be able to escape." Tasha felt a surge of adrenaline. "Yes, that's it. If we can show David his true face on the wedding day, we can make him face the consequences of his actions. We can't let him build a new life on lies." The friends agreed, and a new determination took hold of the group. They knew the task ahead wouldn't be easy, but they were willing to fight. "Let's do this together," Tasha said, her voice firm and full of conviction. "Let's show everyone that the truth cannot be silenced." With their plans in mind, they prepared for their wedding day, an event that would become a milestone in the fight against oppression and injustice. Each of them knew that, together, they had the strength to stand up to David and expose his abuses. Their unity and courage made them more powerful than anyone could have imagined. Tasha looked out of the window of her small apartment, the morning sun filtering through the curtains, but she couldn't feel enlightened. David's dismissal still echoed in her mind, like an echo of a cruel reality. At the same time, a mixture of anger and determination was growing inside her. That wouldn't be the last time David heard her name. She needed to prepare herself for what was to come. Sitting at the kitchen table, steaming cup of coffee in hand, Tasha revisited her memories. She imagined the day she started working at that company, full of hopes and dreams. How hard she had worked, striving to be recognized, and how undervalued she had felt. The image of David, with his arrogant smile, made her stomach knot. Never again, she whispered to herself, determined not to let her achievements be erased by a man who thought he was untouchable. On the day of the wedding, while preparing herself emotionally, Tasha met up with her friends in a cozy cafe. The air was filled with laughter and conversation, but Tasha couldn't feel at ease. When they sat down at the table, her friends noticed the tension in her gaze. "Tasha, are you all right?" asked Anna with concern. I'm trying to get ready," Tasha replied, looking down at the table. "Today is his wedding day, and I can't let that go unnoticed. He needs to pay for what he's done." Her friends looked at each other in solidarity. "You're not alone in this," said Beatrice, holding Tasha's hand. "We know what he did, and it's time we stopped being afraid." "Were you his victims too?" Tasha asked, her voice trembling. "Yes," Anna confirmed. "He always had a way of manipulating people. I couldn't resign because he threatened my career. But I'm no longer the only one who feels this way. We have to do something," said Beatrice firmly. "If David thinks he can get away with this, he's very much mistaken." Tasha felt a shiver run down her spine. Her friend's words encouraged her, and she began to think about how she could act. "Let's band together to expose the truth," Tasha suggested, with a glint of determination in her eyes. "Today, at his wedding, we need everyone to know who he really is." As the day progressed, Tasha prepared herself, remembering the humiliations she had suffered. Every insult from David, every moment when he made her feel less, was like a poignant reminder of her pain. With every piece of clothing she put on, she felt she was arming herself for battle. However, looking at herself in the mirror, Tasha hesitated. "What if he shuts me up again?" she thought, but then remembered the voices of her friends. "No, this time I won't be silenced." On the day of the wedding, Tasha and her friends gathered in a corner of the church amidst the lush decorations and the well-dressed guests. Soft music played in the background, but the tension in the air was palpable. Tasha felt her heart soar when she saw David at the altar, with an arrogant smile, completely oblivious to what was to come. "We're doing this for all of us," Beatrice whispered, holding Tasha's hand. "For all the women he hurt." "Yes," replied Tasha, taking a deep breath. "It's time to bring the truth to light." They looked at each other, and at that moment, a wave of courage washed over them. Tasha knew that this scene could change everything, not just for her, but for all the women who had been silenced. With one last look of determination, she headed for the church door, feeling the weight of history on her back, but also the hope that the truth would set her free. Tasha took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision she was about to make. David's wedding day had finally arrived, and the church was packed with guests, all eager to celebrate the union between him and Sarah. But for Tasha, this event was not a celebration. It was the opportunity she had been waiting for to expose the truth about the man who had dehumanized her, and who, in his arrogance, believed he could get away with it. As she entered the church, Tasha felt everyone's gaze turn to her. The soft music that filled the room seemed to quieten, and the murmur of conversation was replaced by a disconcerting silence. She felt like she was in a movie where the protagonist finally stands up to her oppressor. Nervousness invaded her, but the determination to do justice for her own pain and the pain of so many other women strengthened her. David stood at the altar with a confident smile on his face, completely oblivious to what was about to happen. He looked like the epitome of a happy groom, while Tasha thought of all the times he had sneered at her work, her ideas, and above all, her dignity. She walked slowly towards the altar, her determined steps echoing on the polished wooden floor. When she finally reached the front of the church, David's gaze turned to confusion, and the guests began to murmur, puzzled. "How could you be so selfish, David?" Tasha began, her voice firm but charged with emotion. "You present yourself as a leader, But behind that facade, you're a manipulator and an abuser. The murmuring in the church grew, and some people began to wonder what was going on. David, visibly uncomfortable, tried to interrupt. "Tasha, what are you doing here? This is no place for you," he said, trying to keep his composure. "It's no place for you, David," Tasha replied, ignoring his attempt to silence her. "You hide behind an expensive suit and fake smiles while destroying lives along the way. You fired so many women, all victims of your abusive behavior. I'm just one of them." She felt the adrenaline coursing through her veins, each word empowering her more. The guests began whispering among themselves, some looking shocked, others with expressions of disbelief. Sarah, who was a few steps away from David, looked at him with an expression of confusion and concern. "Tasha, you don't know what you're talking about," she said, not knowing whether to believe the words of the woman who was exposing her fiancé. Tasha, sensing Sarah's hesitation, continued. "You don't know who he really is. He had an affair with a co-worker, a woman who had no choice but to leave the company because of his harassment. Do you think that's love? Do you think he deserves to be by your side?" The revelation hit the room like a bombshell. The guests' expressions changed from curiosity to shock, and the tension was palpable. David, now pale, tried to pull himself together, but Tasha realized that her words were beginning to penetrate the defensive barrier he had built up over the years. "You can't do this, Tasha," David exclaimed, his voice shaking. "This is ridiculous. You're lowering yourself." But Tasha's determination only grew. She wasn't there to put herself down. She was there to stand up. "Ridiculous is thinking that you can destroy lives and carry on as if nothing had happened," Tasha retorted, looking David in the eye, challenging him to explain himself. "You're not a hero, but a villain in disguise. And today, the truth comes out." At that moment, the whole church seemed to be in a state of emotional upheaval, and Tasha knew it was only the beginning. She was there not just to expose David, but to give a voice to all the women who had suffered in silence. Her strength was showing, and with every word, she felt that she was finally in control of her own narrative. As Tasha took the floor, a heavy silence hung in the church. She could feel the adrenaline pulsing through her veins as emotions swelled in her chest. The gazes of the guests, which had previously been fixed on the altar, now turned to her, and the tension in the room became palpable. Tasha took a deep breath, remembering all the nights she had lain awake, thinking about what David had done to her life and the lives of so many other women. With a firm voice, she began to speak. "David always presented himself as a man of integrity, an admirable leader," she said, looking directly at her fiancé, who was pale and nervous. "But the truth is very different. Behind this facade of perfection, there is a man who abused the power he had, who manipulated and harassed his female employees, leaving a trail of pain and destruction wherever he went." Murmurs broke out among the guests, who exchanged confused and astonished looks. Tasha felt powerful, but also vulnerable, because she knew she was stirring up a hornet's nest. Her courage seemed contagious, and soon other women began to stand up. "I was harassed by him too," said a curly-haired woman whom Tasha recognized as a former colleague. She was visibly nervous, but the determination in her voice was undeniable. "He made me feel small and insignificant, as if I had no value at all." "And me," shouted another woman from the audience, raising her hand. "He fired me when I refused his advances. I wasn't the only one, and that's not fair." The indignation in her voice made more women feel encouraged to speak out. Voices began to overlap, and the church became a safe space for victims to speak out. "David, you can't just hide behind your position and think you're above it all. We won't be silenced anymore," exclaimed one of the women, while the others applauded. Tasha, moved, saw that their struggle was only just beginning. We're not just here to expose you, David. We are here to show all the women who have been through this that they are not alone. We want the truth to come out. The strength in Tasha's words reverberated through the church, as if each syllable was breaking the chains that held her in fear. David, who until then had been paralyzed, finally stirred, trying to stop the flow of revelations. "Enough! This is ridiculous. You're just trying to ruin my marriage." His voice sounded desperate, but the women were undeterred. "Ridiculous is what you've done to our lives, David," Tasha replied, her voice echoing through the room. "You can no longer control our narrative. The truth is more powerful than any lie you've told yourself or anyone else." The murmurs of indignation turned into shouts of support. The atmosphere was charged with emotion, and the solidarity between the women became increasingly evident. Tasha felt a surge of hope as she realized that she was not alone. They were together, united by a greater purpose, and their courage was creating a space of empowerment. "Each of us has a story, and today we are here to tell them," said one woman with a determined look on her face. "David, your era of manipulation and abuse is over. Now we have the voice." Her words were met with deafening applause, and the energy in the room became almost electric. Tasha looked around and saw expressions of support and encouragement on the faces of other women. David, on the other hand, looked increasingly cowed, as if the collective pressure was dismantling the image he had built up over the years. "We won't stop here," Tasha said, her voice resonating with conviction. "Today, we claim our dignity, and if you think you can silence us, you're very wrong." With that, the transformation of the ceremony into an act of resistance was complete. Indignation had taken over the space, and the collective strength of the women had become a cry for justice that would echo far beyond the walls of the church. In the heat of the moment, the tension in the church was palpable. Tasha, her voice firm, faced David, who was now visibly pale and nervous. He was trying to keep his composure, but sweat was dripping down his forehead. "What are you doing here?" he whispered, trying to ignore the crowd that was starting to murmur in confusion. "I'm here to speak the truth, David," Tasha replied, her voice echoing in the nave of the church, "and that truth can no longer be silenced." Her gaze was piercing. She had been through so many humiliations, and now she finally felt in control. "You have no right to interrupt this day." David tried to assert himself, but the indignation on the guests' faces made his authority evaporate. Tasha took a deep breath, feeling the silent support of her friends behind her, ready to join her fight. "Right?" Tasha asked, with a sarcastic tone. "You're the one who doesn't have the right to get married while you hide your crimes. What you did to so many women, including me, cannot be forgotten. You presented yourself as an exemplary leader, but behind that facade, you are a manipulator and an abuser." The murmurs in the church grew louder, and Tasha saw the look of shock and confusion on the face of Sarah, the bride, who was beginning to realize that nothing was as it seemed. Tasha continued, "David had an affair with a co-worker who was forced to resign. He harassed her and destroyed her career. Do you really think you can get married while so many of us are left behind, traumatized and silenced?" David shifted nervously, trying to regain his composure. "Those are just lies. You're trying to ruin my marriage." He spoke angrily, but his voice was shaking. "Lies," Tasha repeated, indignant. "Lies are the basis of your life. Do you think you can just carry on manipulating and controlling the people around you?" "No. That ends today." She paused, looking at the crowd that was now gathering, some beginning to stand up in solidarity. "I'm not the only one who has suffered. Many here know their true colors." At that moment, a woman from the audience, a former work colleague of David's, raised her hand. "It's true," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "He made me feel small, like I was worthless. I had to quit my job because of him." Her statement prompted other women to speak up, raising their voices in support of Tasha. Tasha felt a surge of courage when she saw other women joining her. We are here to make this space safe. It's time to stop suffering in silence. We no longer have to carry the weight of abuse and manipulation. "You're being tricked," David shouted, trying to divert attention. "Don't believe these lies, please." But the power of the united voices was growing. "No more lies," shouted another woman, and soon several others joined her. The atmosphere in the church changed from a wedding ceremony to an act of resistance and collective empowerment. Tasha, now feeling strengthened by the support of so many women, looked directly at David. "You can't control us anymore. We are stronger together, and we have decided that the truth must prevail." At that moment, a feeling of hope began to permeate the atmosphere. The courage of Tasha and the other women was creating a wave of transformation, and David, realizing that his manipulation was being exposed, finally found himself with no way out. The guests looked on with disapproval, and the facade he had built up over the years was crumbling before their eyes. The atmosphere in the church was tense, and indignation was spreading like wildfire. David, who used to be so self-assured, now seemed a shadow of his former self. He tried to keep his composure, but his hands were shaking slightly, and his face, normally so confident, was pale. Listening to Tasha spout her accusations, all he could do was stutter out nonsense words, trying to regain control of the situation. "But that's not true!" exclaimed David, his voice breaking. "You can't believe that! I'm a leader! I've always treated everyone with respect." Voices of support for Tasha began to echo through the church. Women, one by one, rose from their pews, joining the fight. One of them, Clara, a former work colleague, shouted, "Respect? You never respected anyone, David. It was always about you." Clara's words were like a trigger for other women. They began to share their stories of harassment and manipulation, each account more devastating than the last. The atmosphere changed rapidly, from a moment of celebration to an impromptu tribunal. The growing murmur turned into shouts of outrage, and the crowd became more and more united. "This is a trap, a conspiracy," David insisted, his desperate gaze fixed on Sarah, who seemed paralyzed, trying to process everything that was happening. "Sarah, you can't believe them. I love you." "Love?" Tasha interjected, her voice firm and clear. "What you call love is control and manipulation. You've destroyed lives, David. Not just mine, but that of so many other women who felt small and insignificant under your gaze." Sarah's father, an influential businessman, couldn't keep quiet. He stood up, trying to defend David. "This is absurd. David is a successful man, a pillar of our community. He can't be accused like this, without proof." "Evidence?" Tasha replied, with a determined glint in her eyes. "You want proof? Look around you. See how many women have stood up to speak the truth. That's all the proof you need." The tension in the church intensified, and the voices of support became a deafening chorus. The crowd was on Tasha's side, and David, realizing that his exemplary leader facade was crumbling, was desperately trying to find a way out. "I have not done anything wrong. You're attacking me for no reason," he shouted, but his voice was already losing strength. The indignation was palpable. People began to move, surrounding him, demanding answers. "David, you can't keep hiding behind lies," Tasha said, approaching him. "The era of manipulation and abuse that you perpetuated is over. Your words have no power here." Meanwhile, Sarah, still in shock, looked at David with a mixture of confusion and pain. Tears streamed down her face, and she finally seemed to wake up from the illusion she had been living in. "How can you do this to me, David?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. I thought you were different." David hesitated, not knowing what to say. "Sarah, I can explain," he began, but the growing murmur of the crowd quickly silenced him. "There is no explanation that can justify your actions," Tasha said, her determination unwavering. "The truth is here, laid bare, before us all. You can no longer escape it." The church hall, once a space for celebration, became an emotional battleground. The empowered women shared their stories, while David found himself increasingly isolated. He was no longer the center of attention. On the contrary, he was now a figure of contempt and disgust. "The time has come for you to face the consequences of your behavior," Tasha finished, looking David in the eye with disdain. "And it's time for us women to reclaim our voices and our dignity." David, now cornered and speechless, felt the weight of everyone's gaze on him. The shield he had used for so long was broken, and the truth, finally revealed, left him naked in his shame. The church was in turmoil. Shock and indignation hung in the air like a storm about to explode. Tasha, with a firm and decisive voice, had revealed David's dark secrets, and now attention was focused on Sarah, who stood paralyzed before the altar, tears streaming down her face. The bride's confused and anguished look reflected the internal struggle she was facing. "Sarah, you need to understand what he really is," Tasha exclaimed, her heart beating fast. "He's not the man you think he is. He has manipulated and destroyed lives, including yours." Sarah looked at David, who was now pale and trembling, trying in vain to keep his composure. Looking down at her hands, she muttered, I can't believe this is happening." Her voice was laden with despair, and Tasha realized that the moment was crucial. "Sarah," Tasha continued, taking a step forward, "he took advantage of your innocence. He presented himself as an exemplary leader, but behind that facade, he's an abuser. You're not alone. There are many of us." Sarah looked up, searching for the strength that seemed to have disappeared. "But I thought he loved me. How could I not have realized that before?" Her voice trembled, and the fear had turned into a silent cry for help. The pain in her words resonated in the church, and other women began to move, feeling the need to join Tasha. "You're not the only one who's been deceived," a woman from the crowd stood up. "I've worked with him for years, and I know how he manipulates everyone around him. He made me feel insignificant, as if I had no value." Several other voices rose in support. "He harassed me too. He fired me when I opposed him." The chorus of testimonies intensified, and Sarah, now surrounded by women who shared similar stories, began to understand the depth of betrayal. Tasha turned to Sarah, her expression now softer. "You don't have to stay with him anymore. You have the opportunity to rewrite your own story. Together, we can do it." Sarah's gaze intensified. The confusion was dissipating, giving way to determination. I can't go on like this. I don't want to be a victim anymore." Her voice was stronger now, and she turned to David, who was backing away, cowering. "You tricked me, David. I don't know how I could have been so blind." Sarah's words echoed through the church, and the atmosphere changed. The atmosphere of indignation was transformed into one of empowerment. Women who had previously been afraid to speak out were now coming together, creating a safe environment for everyone to share their experiences. "Sarah, you're stronger than you think," Tasha said, encouraging her. "You have the power to break free. Don't let it define who you are." With tears still streaming down her face, Sarah raised her head. "I'm not going to let him control me anymore. I want to be free." The words pulsed in the air, and a murmur of support spread through the congregation. Each testimony, each word of support, created a healing space. The voices intertwined in a hymn of resistance, and Tasha felt a surge of hope. She looked at Sarah, realizing that the two of them were now united for a greater cause. "We're going together. Sarah, this is just the beginning. The fight for truth and dignity has only just begun." Sarah nodded, and a shy smile appeared on her face. "Thank you, Tasha. Thank you for having the courage to show me the truth." Together, they turned to the congregation, where other women were standing up, ready to share their stories. The church, once a space for celebration, was now transformed into a symbol of empowerment and solidarity. And as Tasha and Sarah joined these voices, a new alliance was forming, a movement that promised to change lives and bring justice. The tension in the church was palpable, like the pressure before a storm. Tasha, with her heart racing and her voice firm, had revealed the truth about David. And now he was surrounded by suspicious and indignant looks. As the murmurs turned into cries of outrage, David found himself isolated in a sea of disappointment and contempt. The masks he had worn for so long began to fall away, revealing the real man behind the facade of exemplary leader. "David, you can't get away with what you've done," shouted one of the officials who had risen from the crowd. "We know who you really are." The woman, with a determined look, joined Tasha, and soon other voices began to emerge, forming a chorus of resistance. David, pale and nervous, tried to regain control of the situation. "This is a huge mistake. You're confusing things," he exclaimed, his voice shaking. He, who had always presented himself as a strong man, now looked small and vulnerable, his arrogance crumbling under the weight of the truths exposed. "Deception? How can you talk about deception when your actions speak louder than your words?" Tasha replied, advancing towards him. "You destroyed lives, and now you want to hide behind a lie." Her gaze was piercing, and David felt the weight of every word. The courage of Tasha and the other women around him disarmed him, and he knew there was no escaping that reality. I'm a leader. I always have been," he tried to argue, but his voice sounded weaker and weaker, as if he was getting lost in his own empty rhetoric. "You're accusing me without proof. That's not fair." "Fair?" Tasha laughed, a bitter laugh. "Fair is what you've never been with any of us. The evidence is in front of everyone. Your victims are here, willing to talk. You have no more power over us." The determination in his voice reverberated through the church, causing everyone present to unite in support. At this point, David tried to walk away, but some guests began to stand up, forming a blockade around him. "You're not getting off that easy, David," said a co-worker, his tone grave. "We need to hear you take responsibility." The crowd began to stir, and the indignation grew like wildfire. Desperate, David looked down the aisle for some support, but found only cold, disappointed faces. He turned again to Tasha, who was approaching, her eyes filled with a determination he had never seen before. "You no longer have control over anything, David. The game is over," she said, with a calm that contrasted with the chaos around her. "You cannot do this to me. The boss. Better than you," he shouted, arrogance still trying to creep into his voice, but the words sounded empty, like echoes of a past that would no longer be tolerated. Indignation grew, and resistance became a collective force. "Better? Look around you. You're no better than anyone else here. You're a man who hides behind a facade and who has destroyed lives in his path," Tasha replied, now just a few steps away from him. "And now you have the audacity to try to set yourself up as the victim? No more. The world is tired of men like you." She saw the change in David's face, anger and shame, fighting for control. He tried to open his mouth for another defense, but the words failed him. The gaze of the guests was becoming increasingly hostile, and the pressure was becoming unbearable. "What are you going to do now, David?" Tasha asked defiantly. "Are you going to keep playing the victim, or are you finally going to face the truth?" And in that instant, David realized that his world was falling apart. He was completely isolated, surrounded by those who had once feared or admired him. The era of manipulation and abuse was coming to an end, and he had nowhere left to hide. With one last desperate look, he realized that there was no turning back. Shame, contempt, and the fall of his image were now within everyone's reach, and the only thing that remained was the certainty that his era of power had come to an end. Tasha felt her heart race when Sarah, in tears, raised her voice. After hearing the truths revealed about David, the young bride was in a complete state of confusion. She looked around the church, the looks of indignation and disapproval from the guests weighing on her like an impending storm. Her courage was about to emerge, and Tasha could feel it in the air. "I have a story too," Sarah said, her voice shaky but determined. "I didn't want to believe it was true, but David has manipulated me ever since I joined the company. He made me feel special, unique, and then everything changed." Her words came out as a whisper, but soon became firm. "He harassed me, made me feel that I was worthless without him. It was like I was trapped in a web, and I couldn't see reality." The murmuring in the church increased, and Tasha felt a wave of solidarity. The women around her, who had seemed hesitant before, were now standing up, uniting their voices in a powerful chorus of resistance. "You're not alone, Sarah," shouted one of David's co-workers, who had also been silenced and devalued. "We're all in this together." David, pale and desperate, tried to defend himself, but his voice sounded weaker and weaker. "Sarah, I love you. This is all a big lie." He looked at her with pleading eyes, but Sarah didn't hesitate. "Do you love me? Is that how you love someone, David? By manipulating and disrespecting? I let you control me, but that ends here. I'm not a victim anymore." Her voice echoed through the church, and the previously perplexed guests were now completely involved in the scene, their indignation turning into support. Tasha, sensing the growing strength, walked over to Sarah and took her hand. "Together, we are stronger. It's time to expose the truth and give a voice to all those who have suffered under your clutches." The two women looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. They were both survivors, and now they were ready to fight. As the other women began to stand up, sharing their stories of abuse and oppression, the atmosphere in the church changed. What should have been a day of celebration became a powerful act of resistance. "David, you can no longer hide who you really are," shouted another woman, who remembered the harassment she had suffered and the fear that had accompanied her for so long. "No more silence, no more fear." The church was filled with voices, and each story shared seemed to give Tasha and Sarah more strength. They became the center of this hurricane of courage. "We will no longer allow you to destroy lives," said Tasha, her voice now strong and powerful. "The era of silence is over." David, now isolated and in despair, tried to run away, but the crowd was determined to confront him. "Where do you think you're going?" asked one of the guests, grabbing him by the arm. "You must account for everything you've done." Tasha and Sarah, now standing together, looked directly at David. "You thought you could hide behind a facade of success and respect, but the truth always comes out," said Tasha, as Sarah nodded beside her. "And now you'll have to face the consequences." The collective cry for justice echoed through the church, and David remained silent, unable to articulate a defense. He found himself surrounded, and the strength of the women's union held him prisoner in his own web of lies. Finally, Sarah, still holding Tasha's hand, looked at the audience and declared, "I am no longer a victim. I am a survivor, just like all of you. Together, we are unstoppable." The crowd erupted in applause and shouts of support as Tasha and Sarah, hand in hand, walked toward the church exit. As they left, a new alliance formed between them. The sun was shining outside, and the light seemed to symbolize a new beginning. Tasha felt a surge of hope inside her. Not only had they exposed the truth, but they had also freed themselves from a weight they had carried for far too long. The fight for justice and dignity had begun, and together they were ready to face any challenge that came their way. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment your thoughts. Your participation is very important to us. See you next time.